Друзья, добрый день. Я рад вас
Dear colleagues,
приветствовать.
dear friends, good afternoon. I'm very happy to welcome you at the Valdai Discussion Club. Here we have our friends and our colleagues
Партнеров
and
и
our
товарищей за
partners
рубежом.
from abroad.
Работали
We've
по
been
обмене
working together, exchanging opinions, and today we would like to revisit those unilateral restrictions and to discuss them
их применения как в отношении
with the view of applying them
так и
to
партнеров
adversaries and allies and partners.
примеров
We have a number of examples,
применяются на фоне
like Russian case, when those sanctions are applied in the context of a deep political crisis, but they are also applied to India, which is a US partner, in the form of tariffs, as well as military allies. Take Turkey, for example, some political leaders and structures when those sanctions are used against legal entities and persons in ally countries. For example, European Union, there is 100 of legal entities and persons in European Union that face sanctions at this point. U.S. Supreme Court has decided that those tariffs introduced by Donald Trump within this law that is about tariffs, and those tariffs are used as in the form of sanctions when they were used against Western allies and trade partners. That is referred to IEEPA. So this phenomenon is something that we are going to discuss because at this point it's hard to understand who is going to face those sanctions next. Whether you are an ally or a friend or an enemy of the United States, you might still face those sanctions. So US diplomacy tells us that you need to change your diplomacy, you need to change your behavior in international affairs, but we still understand that those sanctions are applied towards allies as well, being business as usual of sorts. So thus, lifting of sanctions will be rather conditional. At any point, this might be reversed. So I wrote a brief article for our website, a note on applying sanctions against allies and partners and adversaries alike. Ekaterina Arapova also writes a lot. So we are going to discuss it with our colleagues and friends. We have Director on Center for Sanctions Policy Expertise at the Institute of International Studies in Gimel University. We also have our friend and colleague, Vice Minister of People's Power for Economy and Finance of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, William Alfredo Castillo, joining us online. From India, our friend and colleague is joining us, a research fellow for energy and environment at Gateway House, Amit Bandari, our friend and colleague from Southeast Norway University, Glenn Desan, and our colleague, research director at the Ankara Institute, Turkey, Taha Ashan. I'm very glad to welcome you, dear colleagues, and I would like to change the order a little bit. Let's start with William, then we'll move forward to Ekaterina, then Amit, then Glenn, and Taha. Then we'll have a Q&A session. 10 minutes for each speech. So I'm giving the floor to Mr. Castilla. Mr. Vice Minister, you have the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. In the name of the government of Venezuela, of the President Nicolás Maduro, and the active President Delcy Rodriguez, I thank Balda Club for this invitation, especially to my respected and dear friend Ivan Timofey. Thank you, Ivan. I'm sure you are very interested in knowing a little more about what is happening in Venezuela. I don't sure that I can dissipate all your doubts, obviously, but in any case, I will try to describe, broadly speaking, the situation on the ground. After 25 years of economic and political aggression, of an hostile and illegal policy, which main goal has been to achieve a regime change in Venezuela, and after 11 years of sanctions, on last January 3rd, the United States crossed the red line, perpetrating a cruel military attack against the territory, population, and the authority of Venezuela, including the kidnapping of the president and the first lady. More than 100 people died, including civilians and soldiers. Another 100 were injured during this military aggression, which was not a judicial action, but tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government using massive and high-tech military resources. The violation of Venezuela's sovereignty is extremely grave, an unprecedented fact in almost 200 years of relations between both countries that mean a historical stain that will never be erased. This event has moved geopolitical board, opening a new period in relation between United States and Venezuela. After January 3rd, USA tries to convert its foreign policy towards Venezuela, marked by economic suffocation and regime change, into a strategy of economic and political control of our country. And this implies the transformation of sanctions into a lever to boost USA participation in Venezuelan economy. As you know, I'm sure that you know, this is a complete paradox, because it was the United States that cut its economic and energy relations with Venezuela since 2019, when the first Trump administration decreed a total embargo on the export of Venezuelan oil and hydrocarbons to USA market, sanctioning PDVSA chips and aircraft, and freezing all its resources and assets abroad. This is the same what Russ recently said, with other words, the CEO of Halliburton in the White House in front of Donald Trump. Venezuela never used oil as a political weapon against the United States or another country. Hugo Chavez never did it, and Nicolás Maduro never did it. It was the sanction of the Trump administration since 2017 that forced American and European companies and pressured those of other countries to leave Venezuela. You can see the graph on hydrocarbon export from Venezuela to USA from 2014 to 2025, please. You will see that I said to you that is the fact that Venezuela never refused to sell oil on hydrocarbon to USA. Venezuela never refused to have normal trade and oil relations with the United States. It has been the White House during 4 administrations that has tried to destroy economy and kneel Venezuela like it's doing in other countries in the region and the world. In fact, as you can see in the next slide, please, the complex sanction regime against Venezuela remains almost intact. At February 2026, a total of 1,088 unilateral coercive measures have been used against Venezuela, of which 171 has been imposed on the oil industry. This includes the blockade of access to a Cisco refining complex, freezing of access and reserve of Venezuela in the international financial system, and multilateral agencies such as International Monetary Fund. 60 aircraft and 85 vessels remain under sanctions, both from Venezuela and abroad, and hard financial, technological, and commercial restrictions remain in place. Between 2025 and so far, obviously, in 2026, the Trump administration imposed 61 unilateral coercive measures and other restrictive or punitive measures, including tariff of 25% to countries that buy Venezuelan oil and 50% to Venezuelan products. This measure implies that a trade tool, such as tariffs, are being used to achieve political objectives. We are talking about unilateral tariff, tool for economic and political coercion. In 2025, the United States also imposed restrictions on the sale of technology through the America First Decree, illegal seizure of oil tankers that trade oil with Venezuela, restriction on financial transactions in international currency and cryptocurrency, which affect the Venezuelan private sector, including companies that import agricultural inputs to Venezuela. In this condition, Venezuela has entered a new phase. Our country is still under threat, including military threat. The war deployed at the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean remain in place. The calm analysis of the complex situation is what allowed you to understand the action that the government of Venezuela is taking and how these are linked to economic relations, cooperation agreements, and trade exchange with other countries like Russia, China, BRICS, India, for example. Venezuela is living a complex stage in which it must continue to contain the US's military threat while using the tool of international law, diplomacy, and dialogue to seek negotiated ways out of its historical contradiction with the United States. This contradiction was born in the 19th century when Simón Bolívar proposed the doctrine of Latin America and Caribbean unity and independence to confront imperialist ambition of the Monroe Doctrine. The Venezuelan strategy combines containment and negotiation within the framework of sovereignty. The political, energy, financial, and trade agreement being signed with the United States must be understood in this context. I like to use the image of judo, a very intense sport where you don't try to take down your opponent by using your own force, but rather defeat them by using their force. Venezuela is doing a diplomacy judo, an economic judo, and political judo. For me, this is a good metaphor for what Venezuela is doing. On the one hand, the United States has issued a set of licenses or licencias that stimulate participation of American and European oil companies in the Venezuela oil industry. As I said, it returned to a historical situation that existed until 2017. The difference now is that the sanctions have not been lifted, but that they seek to manage their effects through licenses. It's a highly complex and fragile situation. For our part, we have approved a reform of hydrocarbon law which established a set of tax and legal incentives for foreign investment in the oil, gas, and sector. This reform has been discussed in Venezuela for about 2 years, proposed an association scheme between Venezuela state, which retains ownership of hydrocarbon, and the national and international private sector, that under certain conditions might have a majority stake in new projects. It's a relevant legal change, which will allow that continued recovery of oil production, offer fresh resources that our economy needs, pay our debt to the socios and partnerships, and will reposition Venezuela in his role as one of the world's largest producers and holder of the largest global crude oil reserve. The contract and partnership model adopted in the reform of the hydrocarbon law is the same one that emerged from the mechanism designed to overcome the blockade. This model is found presently in Venezuela anti-blockade law, an instrument that allows the country being recovering oil production and strengthen its economy. Due this strategy, in 2025, Venezuela consolidated itself as the fastest growing nation in South America since the end of the pandemic, with GDP growth of 80.5%. Please see the slide. Since the sanction has not been lifted, and it does not appear to will be in the near future, a financial mechanism has been designed to protect the resources involved in this transaction with USA company. This agreement, I repeat, in the context of a complex political negotiation that involved delicate state affairs, such as kidnapping and illegal trial against the president and the first lady, are presented by the White House as a kind of surrender of Venezuela, like a cession or loss of sovereignty. This is completely far away from reality. Venezuela is not and never will be a colony of any power, and the exercise of its sovereignty proclaims its right to maintain economic, commercial, and cooperative relations with any country. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela used peaceful instruments of international law, diplomacy, dialogue, and negotiation to dispel a military threat and defend the territorial integrity, peace, welfare, and rights to Venezuelan people. Of course, we know that behind this lie, the clear intention to restrict our foreign trade under the pretext of fighting supposed extraterritorial enemies of the United States. We know that it's a new doctrine, supremacist and imperial in nature, that exists illegally and by force to reserve the exclusive use of resources of American continent for benefits of a single nation. This is a policy of recolonizing economy incompatible with international law and contrary to the current economic reality, marked by the emergence of new global poles, new commercial and financial systems, new association and alliance, as well as new powerful technology. Venezuela rejects any attempt to restrict free and mutually beneficial trade nation and maintain its firm commitment to the objective of a humanity of shared destination, claiming strategic alliances such as those we have with Russian Federation, the People's Republic of China, and other sovereign nations. As acting President Delcy Rodriguez stated before the National Assembly on January 25, Venezuela has the right to maintain relations of economic cooperation and mutual benefit with all nations and will firmly defend that right. We are doing is protect our national interest. Finally, with the Russian Federation, for example, we share 80 years of relation and 25 years of a solid and fruitful strategic alliance established by President Hugo Chavez and Vladimir Putin in 2001. More than 360 projects are underway in different areas of cooperation, including the energy sector. And in May of last year, President Maduro and President Putin signed the Strategic Partnership Treaty, which elevates relations between our country to the highest level. Beyond the current complex situation, the need to avoid a militaristic escalation, and to defend the peace of Venezuela and our region, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela will continue working with the framework of international responsibility for relations of equality, respect, and cooperation between nations. Venezuela will not renew defense, and see the final slide. Our acting president say, we are not afraid. We defend our right and will continue to advance along the path of its complete economic independence. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, глубоко уважаемый.
Thank you so much, Mr. Castillo.
Такое разностороннее.
It's an extremely comprehensive and deep speech. Thank you so much for those slides with some figures. It was very interesting to have a look at those slides, those data on oil export and economic growth data.
Your huge contribution to our today's meeting. Сейчас я бы вернулся.
Now, I would like to go back to Russia and to give the floor to Ekaterina Arapova.
Вы экономист по своей базовой
You are an economist, you majored in economy, and Mr. Castillo talked about some figures. So what's happening with economies that face the sanctions? I'm talking about allies and adversaries. So in your view, as an economist, what can you say about this impact of tariffs on India and other countries? It's the broadest possible spectrum of issues to discuss. Thank you so much, Ivan Timofeyev. I would like to thank the Valdai Discussion Club, which traditionally holds quite meaningful discussions, and they are also extremely timely. So just recently, some important events took place, sanctions policy of the United States. Ivan Timofeyev talked about what happened on Friday when the Supreme Court ruled that President Trump extended his power, introducing these new tariffs within this national emergency. It's an interesting decision, and it's quite an important one, and it can also predefine the future of relations between the United States, its allies, its rivals. Talking about this economic component, I can say that just recently we had this interesting analysis at MGIMO University. We were trying to assess this total economic damage due to those sanctions. Of course, they are quite diversified, varied, talking about different countries, but there are some states, Baltic states and Nordic states, that had these two-digit losses. They did not get, yes, we are talking about this growth percentage. Yes, we are talking about GDP here. So it's like 19%, 21%, 16%. So this is this range. So these are quite significant and impressive figures. Something this growth they did not gain due to sanctions against Russia. So these figures could serve a starting point in our discussions, and we need to, if we try to analyze this damage and assess this damage, quite often experts, European Union focus on this direct damage, but this indirect damage is huge. So this spiral that started back in 2022, 2023, they should have used this monetary policy against it, but it's always related to new problems and new obstacles to economic growth. So this cumulative effect results in this range that I just mentioned. So our world is global indeed. So these sanctions against individual countries, especially large economic powers that ensure that certain level of gravity in order to affect prices, global prices, they would hit economies of countries imposing those sanctions more than countries that face those sanctions. This is this interrelation that results in the significant losses for countries introducing sanctions. At the same time, we have this high level of adaptability for countries under sanctions in terms of diversifying trade and economic flows. Of course, we can't say that all those sanctions introduced against our country in recent years that it would not hit our economy. Of course, it did, but we do have the significant adaptability capacity. I'd like to go back to what we just started with today, the Supreme Court ruling, what it means for the world. It's a very interesting decision because it would make Trump come back several months back. On the one hand, because all those tariffs that were introduced under this IEPA law, of course, he wouldn't just forget about this policy, especially these sanctions, these tariffs. He prefers tariffs to classical sanctions, and he will continue moving along this path. But this legal foundation is transforming, so it's no longer under this law. Yes, now it's under this law of 1947. So this legal component is changing, but the course remains the same. But still, it's not a total carte blanche for President Trump. He can only introduce 15% tariffs without approval from Congress, and not those figures that were present last year. So what that results in is that, on the one hand, we have these short-term beneficiaries of these processes, all those countries against which those tariffs were imposed or that were threatened with those tariffs. Asian countries and his partners like Brazil, some Latin American states that faced those higher tariffs, and they are the short-term beneficiaries of the process. But on the other hand, this makes allies, rivals, and for Mr. Trump, the policies are not that different towards allies and rivals. He wouldn't rank them. But almost all states that interacted with the United States last year, they tried to put this negotiation process on hold. Those countries that already reached those agreements but have not ratified them yet, for example, European countries, they are now talking about whether they should ratify them at all. Some of them believe that this should be done, but still, at this point, we can see this new short-term uncertainty when it's unclear how President Trump is going to proceed. So those countries that are involved in negotiation process, they are not going to accelerate this process. And that would be true for India. Just recently, we heard that this negotiation process was postponed or prolonged because they need to understand what is going to happen with tariffs policy of President Trump. Those countries that signed the agreement but have not ratified it yet are not going to accelerate it. So we have this vacuum, and the world will try to understand and this decision and those mechanisms that will guide President Trump. Another specific feature of President Trump's policy was using so-called secondary tariffs when they were introduced against third states for continuing relations with sanctioned countries, and we all know about those additional tariffs against India in August, and new tariffs against trade partners of Iran just last month. They were introduced for continuing trade relations with Iran. So those secondary tariffs are yet another specific feature of sanction, coercive policy of the current US president. And it's also unclear at this point what's going to happen next, because this is a tool of trade war on the one hand, but if we focus on purposes, they are classical sanctions. They are secondary, third economies face them because of interacting with those sanctioned players. So what is the legal foundation for that lays the basis of those secondary tariffs? I believe it to be an open question, because those secondary tariffs introduced by President Trump last year were most efficient. They were at least more efficient as compared to just restricting specific companies or banks, because in that case, adaptability is much higher. But if we're talking about economy as a whole, this level of compliance and readiness to negotiation process can be much higher for partner countries, and that is what President Trump wanted, actually. But we can see this global paradox when, on the one hand, we can see this US administration policy when this level of short-term control over partners is growing, because a large number of countries that are economically dependent on US and US economy, they are ready to negotiate, and we've seen that throughout 2025. On the other hand, in midterm, we can see that all partners want to be more autonomous politically, economically, and they want to develop new tools to ensure their financial, technological sovereignty, digital sovereignty. And this paradox is quite an interesting one. Short-term control, but mid-term separation from the markets and this global player that is least predictable and most strict one. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that recent months have shown us that the United States put more pressure on marine transports and thus oil producing areas, shipment areas, where those vessels. It's also an important and quite terrifying precedent, because the sanction policy results in global trust crisis, trust to reserve currencies, intellectual property rights, and undermines trust to this market pricing mechanism. But these facts were there's vessels, when this happens in international waters, it's also related to marine law issues. So this is yet another thing that I consider to be of importance, because these actions would, of course, result in counteractions, and there will be some countermeasures by states whose vessels are attacked, such as, and this could include some actions, and this would result in more escalation and new hotbeds in various regions. I'd like to go back to your initial question. Our world is global indeed, so economic damage of sanctions, the countries introducing sanctions, they suffer more economic damage than the countries that are faced with sanctions. But of course, we understand that decision makers are one thing, and it's not always that those ruling elites, they are so concerned with those economic aspects. But we need to understand that, and we need to take that into consideration. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's quite interesting that this legal context, there is no term, no notion, secondary tariffs. It's not part of any executive decree, so it's more of a political notion. But the Supreme Court's ruling, I think that it's like which oil we should use to fry our partners. Vegetable oil or sunflower oil. And now the Supreme Court decided that we can't use vegetable oil, but we can use the law of 1974. But yes, this delay of 90 days, but still, it's also about these tariffs. It's just 15% now. As far as I understand, it's like 15% instead of 10%, which was a baseline. If memory serves me, Article 102 states that unilaterally, president can only introduce tariffs of no more than 15%. So that's the limit for him without Congress's approval. So he believed that he had this carte blanche last year, and now he does not have this mechanism. So this range for tariffs that he can introduce unilaterally is now limited. There is one more thing here, just exchanging opinions. When Biden introduced tariffs with respect to Russian aluminum, and he also used the law of 1974, but that was more than 15%. There was a different story there. He also used this law on putting normal relations on hold, but with the majority of allies, they have normal trade relations. So of course there is so much room for interpretation. And we will see some attempts by the president to try to interpret the law broader, law of 1974, but his opponents will try to bring him back and make him respect that limits. And I would like to give the floor to Amit Bandari. We mentioned India and the secondary tariffs against India for purchasing Russian oil. And February 2nd, after President Trump talked to Prime Minister Modi, it was declared that the United States will not use these tariffs, and on February 9th, there was this executive decree, and then it was said that India is no longer going to purchase Russian oil in exchange to lifting this tariff. So what's happening? What's really happening? We were listening to foreign minister in Munich, and he said that India has autonomous policy and that respects national interests, and if that's in line with national interests, they are going to buy this oil. So he put it quite diplomatically, and he said that it's not that simple. So you are an expert in energy, you are a scholar, so what can you say about the secondary tariffs and with regard to Russian oil? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ivan. So while India does not officially recognize unilateral sanctions, the kind that US has imposed on Russia, commercial enterprises and business concerns have to work around these sanctions because they cannot afford to be cut away from the US financial systems. So even when the government says that we don't recognize sanctions on Russia and we continue to have a partnership, companies often find that they have to follow the American sanctions or the American decree in such matters. And this is the reason why we would probably, we have seen, it has been reported in the media that India's imports of Russian oil have reduced in the last few weeks. And I suspect this is the reason for that decrease, that commercial enterprises are afraid of crossing the American lines. Now, historically, India has been targeted by American sanctions because of our nuclear program. But in the recent past 1 year to be precise, India has been hit by American tariffs. And this has largely been an attempt to push American goods and services into India. So the trade agreement or the broad outline that was announced in the last 2 weeks, and the details of which have also been changed since the first announcement, include a lot of things about India purchasing American energy, one, and secondly, India purchasing more of American agricultural products, two. Now, you need to remember that many of the American states which vote for the Republican Party, these are less populated states which are in the interior of the United States, and agriculture or petroleum are important industries in these states. So these are important states for the Republican Party, and creating or protecting jobs in these states is therefore going to be a high priority for them as well. Now, as far as the recent Supreme Court judgment is concerned, our view is that the American interest is, there is a certain interest that the US has in this case. And if the Supreme Court has shut one door, I'm reasonably certain that the US will find some other way to bring about the same impact that it desires. And to give you an example, the US has recently withdrawn from the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is driven by a realistic assessment of its own energy needs and what it will need in the next 10 to 15 years. So even if a commitment has been made, the commitment can easily be reversed if it is in the American interest. So, so even if the Supreme Court has made a particular judgment or the US has made a particular commitment, I think we should take it, we should just take it for what has been said. This is not going to be a long-lasting or a permanent agreement. And in this regard, I feel that threat of sanctioning India for purchasing Russian oil is largely based on convenience. The big sanctions on Russian oil started around 2014 during the Crimean crisis and have become increasingly tighter. And these sanctions correlate very closely with increase of oil and gas production within the United States and emergence of US as a major energy exporter. So just around the same time, when America has surplus of oil and gas to sell into the world market, it has become convenient to sanction and make it difficult for the second largest oil seller, which is Russia, to access the global market. And I feel that rather than this is the principle through which we should examine American sanctions on Russia over the last 10 years plus that we have seen. Apart from oil and gas, agriculture and military hardware are two other areas where America desires to sell its physical products. And we shall see policies coming from the US which are designed to favor these two sectors. Apart from these two sectors, these three sectors, energy, agriculture, and defense, our view in India is that artificial intelligence is the next avenue of contest between the United States and China. And this is something we can see from the capital expenditure that is being conducted by top American tech companies such as Alphabet, which is Google, Meta, which is Facebook, and Microsoft. Dominance in the artificial intelligence space will require multiple things for the US. First of all, it will need new supply chains for critical minerals, such as lithium, such as neodymium, dysprosium, etc., which are used for equipment. Second, US will require access to free global data. So, for example, companies like Google and Twitter have trained their algorithms using vast amounts of data that were available to them. And the US will like to continue having access to this data over the next several years so that its tech majors like Alphabet and Microsoft can perfect their AI models. And the third part, which is needed, the third leg for AI dominance, apart from data and critical minerals, is going to be energy. Now, data centers in the United States already consume 5 to 6% of all electricity produced in that country. And reliable energy supplies are probably going to be one of the bottlenecks in winning the AI race. And by controlling the energy markets, by directing the flows, and the US also hopes to have a monopoly or control over the global energy flows and supplies, and potentially restrict the supply of this energy to rivals. And I feel that the actions which have been taken on Venezuela recently, and which are being planned on Iran, even as we speak right now, are probably designed at developing a monopoly on global energy supplies, which can enable it to protect its dominance in the AI chain. So that will be all from me, Ivan. Thank you so much.
Спасибо большое, Амид.
Thank you so much, Amit. You are so precise in defining key aspects. Glenn, we are moving forward to you. Ekaterina has talked a lot about tariffs against European countries. They are not the highest ones as compared to the ones introduced against some other partners and allies, but nevertheless, this Greenland issue is also part of the agenda. Of course, it's not related to sanctions, but still it creates this context. So, in your view, talking about this, how does European Union perceive the United States as a calamity, as a natural disaster, or as such some long-term trend that would result in this difference between Europe and United States, long-term differences? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And as always, thank you for inviting me to this fascinating discussion. I think that this has been a tremendous shock to the Europeans because the Europeans have always been the number one ally of the United States. But then we see as the world shifts towards multipolarity, the Europeans are now a distant third. That is, in terms of priority, that is, the first priority will be the Western Hemisphere. The second will be East Asia. And this is quite a shock to the Europeans. And of course, Trump hasn't hid the fact that he has a personal disliking for the Europeans as well. But I think many Europeans think this is transitional. Just wait out Trump and we'll go back to a new version of Biden. I think this is mistaken because the problems we face are linked to the distribution of power, not about personalities. And it is, of course, always been true that the US will engage in some form of economic coercion against both adversaries and allies. But if we take a step back, I would argue that the logic of economic coercion reflects that of the alliance system. That is, dividing the world into allies and adversaries is largely a hegemonic policy or strategy. So enduring conflicts will then ensure that adversaries will remain contained and weakened, that is, other centers of power, while America's allies will maintain their security dependence on the US, which can then be converted into political and economic loyalties. So economic coercion against allies has the same purpose, that is to maintain economic dependencies and extract political concessions. So we all know that this is not a new thing. The US policies have, they've tended to use these extraterritorial sanctions in order to impose, or secondary sanctions as well, to sanction allies. So for example, the French have been sanctioned back in 2014. That is the BNP Paribas. They were fined 8.9 billion because they had transactions with the different entities in Sudan, Iran, Cuba, and the payments were done in US dollars. So this meant that they went through the US financial system. In other words, the US unilateral domestic sanctions could then also be applied to France. This is, again, not a big secret. And this is also why the Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, told the G7 finance ministers back in 2019 that if you participate in the dollar system, you have to abide by American sanctions. So this is how they essentially have operated, and this is why allies has also have to follow their sanctions. We also saw when the US unilaterally withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, the JCPOA, it could also reimpose sanctions, demanding that the Europeans stop trading with Iran, even though it was the Americans who walked away from the deal. So all of this happened in the past. I think what is new now is that economic sanctions against allies is intensifying. And I think the reason for this is that the world becomes more multipolar, which creates one, pressure for more coercive policies, and the second is the US, to regain its strength and competitiveness, sees it as necessary to have a more, extractive relationship with its allies. So simply put, I think when there's a high degree of economic concentration in a hegemon, it has an incentive, the empire or hegemon, to build trust. Support the development of an open, liberal, international economic system. This is simply in the interest then of the US, because in such a system, the US would like the whole world to develop trust in American technologies, as opposed to pursuing self-sufficiency or diversification. They should all develop dependence on American industries, its supply chains, banks, it's the dollar, the payment system like SWIFT, the physical transportation corridors under the control of the US Navy. And this way, the hegemony can, by having administrative control over the international economy, can be a rent seeker, extracting some economic benefits, but also political concessions. However, this happens in a low intensity manner, which is the possibility, something is possible to do, given that it's a comfortable hegemon. Now, my point is that what's happening now is predictable and is indeed been predicted for decades. That is, when the hegemon declines and new centers of power develop at the periphery, then it's more difficult for the hegemon. Well, it has to use its administrative control in a different way, because now you'll have other centers of power challenging the hegemon. So for this reason, an open, liberal international economic system can't really exist in a system where you have a declining hegemon. Instead, it's quite predictable. One would reverse back to these neo-mercantilist policies, also sanctioning allies. So we see therefore that the hegemon uses sanctions now for two purposes. One, is to weaken adversaries, that is, weaken Russia, China, Iran, any other centers of power. But second, equally important, is to demand geoeconomic loyalty and political obedience from allies, because the US can't compete economically with China, and it simply is in the national interest of allies to begin to diversify, to make themselves not so excessively dependent on the US. So the US has to counter this. And this is what we see now. The US policies towards allies, I think they're twofold. First, they're asked to cut themselves off from other centers of power. So, for example, Russia and China primarily. That is, don't buy Chinese tech, don't buy Russian energy. And this way, the allies become excessively reliant on the United States, creating a, well, more or less an exclusive economic zone for the United States, an inefficient geoeconomic bloc, if you will. The second is to also then begin to extract economic concessions, because the US can't really compete with China. So for this reason, one seeks to transfer some of the economic competitiveness to the United States. So, for example, with the Europeans, they've been asked, you have to buy American weapons, American energy, American technologies, and whatever remains of profits should be reinvested into the United States. This is not just the Europeans. The Taiwanese are asked to transfer semiconductor industries to the US. The Germans, of course, have to transfer some heavy industries to the United States, where the energy prices are more favorable. And again, this is a massive reversal from what happened after the Second World War, when the United States had an incentive to essentially build powerful frontline state, to make sure that Western Germany was more prosperous than Eastern Germany, that Taiwan was more prosperous than continental China, or South Korea more prosperous than North Korea. Now you see the need to essentially extract. And yes, well, our other colleagues have said, this is also what they want to do, put the European model on, for example, the Indians. That is, Trump was quite upset that India chose China and Russia. I don't think this is true. What the Indians said is they can't choose, they can't wed themselves only to one center of power. They rejected the ultimatum, but their ideal would be to trade with everyone, as they should. Because if they would have only accepted a deal only to trade with the United States, they effectively become captured, become excessively dependent on the US, becomes less economically competitive. And also, as our Venezuelan colleagues have suggested, this is essentially the purest model of what the United States wants. That is to conquer a country, make it into a colonial outpost, try to tell them that they can only trade with the United States. If they will trade with other powers, it will be under the American supervision. And again, this is, I guess, the formula. And this is why also allies have sanctions imposed on them, and then different forms of economic coercion. So I think that allies who trust the United States over the decades since the Second World War, they have developed a very high degree of dependence, which is a massive vulnerability, as opposed to adversaries like Russia and China, who always knew that the US could turn this switch on them and put economic sanctions. So they always developed a certain amount of technological sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and also diversified their economic partnership to avoid this. And this is the irony. The more countries trusted the United States, the less prepared they are now to address how the US is readjusting to a multipolar world. And, for example, putting tariffs on the Europeans for resisting the US annexation of Greenland. But I'd just like to finish off saying that none of this is actually sustainable, I think, because by going along and essentially bowing to the will of the United States when it comes with economic sanctions, allies become economically weakened, they become politically subordinated and geopolitically irrelevant. And they essentially ignore their own national interests. That's what the sanctions are intended to do. And this current strategy of the United States is therefore not sustainable, and it's temporary by definition, because at some point allies become only weaker and weaker unless they adjust to the multipolar distribution of power themselves in order to enhance their national interests. So I think that this is why you will see countries essentially have to do what the Indians are trying to do. That is, enhance their self-sufficiency, diversify their partnerships in order to reduce excessive dependence on the United States or any one state or region for that matter. The Europeans, sadly, I would say we're not there yet. The Europeans just celebrated the liberation, or how they liberated themselves from Russian energy. However, without any replacements. This is not how you liberate yourself. You liberate with some self-sufficiency and diversify your partnerships. The way the Europeans liberated themselves was to make themselves excessively dependent on US energy, which means the US can hike the prices, they can put political conditionality, and if, of course, times are hard, they could simply cut off the Europeans nonetheless. And also, of course, seek advantages. The higher the energy cost, the faster the European deindustrialized, and their industries can be cannibalized by the Americans. So, yeah, just in summary, I think that the world must adjust to the economic connectivity for a multipolar world, which entails pursuing some strategic autonomy and diversification. And this is how they avoid sanctions. But again, this is also why the US use sanctions. But it's a bit like bombing Iran to make it give up its deterrent. It's the same now with these sanctions. The United States is using all this economic coercion in order for countries to make themselves exclusively reliant on the United States, which makes the sanctions more painful. So this is not going to work. It's going to cause a lot of short and medium-term pain for allies, but in the long run, they have to diversify in order to survive. So thank you.
Спасибо большое, Глен. Очень интересный.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's a very interesting perspective. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Özhan. And Turkey also faced lots of sanctions. We remember those sanctions against 2 ministers. We remember sanctions for purchasing S-400 system from Russia, and for Turkey's policy in Syria, the ones introduced by the Congress. We can't say that there were too many sanctions, but still they were present. F-35 program and Turkey going back there. There were some threats from European Union that they are not going to continue this military cooperation, Leopard tanks and equipment bought from Germany. So yes, there were cases like that, and Turkey ranks third among the countries in terms of the number of companies that faced secondary tariffs, sanctions in the context of interactions with Russia. This is my personal data. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation. Yeah, you just jump on the issue. In a sense, Turkey is one of the senior sanctioned actors. Get used to it since 1970s in the sense of modern sanction context. But no one should be surprised when a new US sanction comes out, because it's not a rupture in the system, but just a spotlight on how the system already works, because we already live inside an American sanctioned world where economic infrastructure, payments, finance, law, standards, and market access is routinely weaponized, and the choke points can be tightened or relaxed at the will of the Washington. So this is a kind of already sanctioned world. But the central idea, the US does not primarily govern the global economy through sheer dominance or decree. It governs through infrastructure. So through financial rails, legal regimes, technology standards, market access systems that makes the system function. And finally, and lately, through the algorithms. Once infrastructure becomes central, it becomes a leverage. And once it becomes a leverage, it becomes a tool of statecraft. And we can understand this in three, four dynamics, how this is taking place. Usually, when we think US and its power, definitely it's GDP, military, etc. But the more durable form of power lies beneath the visibility in the systems that enable global exchange and who is controlling it and how much controlling it. And because everything rely on it, which just mentioned before me in a very settled, solid presentation. Thank you for that. From dollar to banking networks, trade finance channels, technology standards, legal systems, capital markets, these are all making it. And the systems evolve over the decades, especially last couple of decades. And over the time, asymmetry created. Many countries can participate in the system, and very few can meaningfully govern it or preserve their rights. And take the dollar, which Russia is experiencing, and many other countries. It's not dominant merely because of its history, tradition. It's operationally embedded in trade invoicing, commodity pricing, and many other things. And control flows observability. When that happens in any transaction, it gives directly this power. And we saw when the Ukraine war started how SWIFT weaponized and eventually used against Moscow. So under this control system, access to clearing becoming conditional participation. The same applies in technology issues. For example, the semiconductor production debate continues, more or less similar thing. Through export controls, licensing rules, Washington can regulate not only what American firms sell, but what others can sell if they depend on US tools, and it is taking place. And finally, market access itself is an infrastructure, and US is using it in a very harsh way. Tariffs are another issue, as you follow lately. So this American power operates through these layers of mainly four layers: dollar settlement, compliance governance, export controls, and market access leverage. And this is more or less making governance by infrastructure. So in this context, sanctions are often misread as a blunt instruments. But in reality, US economic coercion is structured and graduated already. It escalates from signaling to targeted restrictions to systemic denial of access. And its effectiveness lies in anticipatory compliance. Actors change behavior not because of penalties happened. It happened already, these tariff regimes, but because exclusion risk is more costly, intolerable. That's why people are trying to somehow find a middle way with Trump and this tariff game. And when doing it, more or less, four things happens. First, a secondary exposure happens. This is the most powerful mechanisms. When US impose a sanction in a non-ally country, let's say Iran, in 2018, it was supposed to be in the front value almost any declared enemy country, Iran, is sanctioned by US, but it's not working that way. It is directly affecting all so-called allied countries because when US imposed that sanction, they forced to choose continue business with Iran or preserve access to US market and finance. So directly, this secondary exposure changing the game. The second thing is the issue linkage. Economic access becomes tied to security alignment. Trade, finance, defense decisions are fused, and countries' procurement choices or geopolitical posture can trigger economic consequences. And here we arrive at Turkey, because Turkey is the best example of this issue linkage. As you just mentioned, in 2020, one of the latest sanctions from the US against Turkey was CAATSA sanctions. Although Turkey is a NATO member, that sanction happened. And the main issue over there was the Ankara purchased the Russian S-400 air defense system. Sanctions targeted Turkey's defense industry sector, but notice the deeper logic was different. The objective was not simply to punish Turkey. It was to enforce a network discipline. So this CAATSA sanctions structured to deter significant transactions with Russia's defense sector first, and later almost all the sectors in Russia. So the message was systemic. If you transact with Russia's defense industry, you face consequences, even if you are an ally. This is a typical example of the weaponized interdependence. The sanction does not only target the state, it regulates behavior within the network. So it tells you how to behave within the system, who buys, who finances, who licenses, who insures, and suddenly Turkey became the enforcement example. And this was not an isolated event, right? Historically, in 1975, more or less similar thing happened by United States. In 2018, you just mentioned, the Turkish ministers sanctioned. 2019 in the Syrian operation, 2020 Russian S-400 purchase. So these episodes reveal a structural pattern. When strategic divergence intensifies, the US uses economic restriction inside alliances. And that creates the paradox. Turkey relies on, in some certain sense, US-linked defense technology, dollar finance, Western capital markets, and in general, the Western markets. But those dependencies create a kind of weakness. And once this vulnerability is demonstrated, it becomes a strategic lesson. So what can be done, or what Turkey did a little bit? Defense diversification, indigenous development, reduce single point technology dependency, and alternative suppliers. But this does not mean immediate decoupling. Network effects remain strong. It's not easy to get it out and not necessarily needed, by the way. But it does mean resilience planning becomes permanent after that. So where we are right now is under this sanctioned global or weaponized global economic trading system and technologies, plus the sanctions, still those sanctions are in effect. Geopolitics, if it can revive again, which is reviving regarding Turkish US relations, then you can open the gates to renegotiate, but you will never arrive back to where you started. So that's quite important. Another thing, a model is regulatory coercion. It's quite important. Sanctions extend beyond named target. Once a person, entity becomes sanctions exposed, banks, insurance, payment processors, suppliers, thing continues. So it's a ripple effect on that. And lastly, selective exemptions and carve-outs. The coercion is rarely absolute. Selective waivers, exemptions, licensing regimes allow Washington to calibrate the pressure at their wishes. This prevents rapid coalition backlash, but at the end of the day, the driver is the Washington itself. So weaponized choke points, sanctions, overall controlling the infrastructure are the main issues. And the Turkish-Russian case is quite important. Yes, alternatives should be developed, but geopolitics and the defense industry plays a lot of role. So both Turkey and Russia, although these sanctions are applied, continued their own way. They didn't cut or change the main nature of the economic and military relations. And we are where we are. And once the geopolitical realities came again, U.S. started to sit with Washington, with Moscow, and start to renegotiate. And Turkey, from Syria to Iraq, from Palestine to NATO issues, restarted their geopolitical renegotiations with the United States, and new gates and the routes are opening. So this is where we are right now. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, доктор Асхан.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashan. You just confirmed lots of things that we know about sanctions against Turkey, and I'd like to add, and Glenn mentioned that, you mentioned that sanctions against the banks, banking system, European banks, Glenn mentioned BNP sanctions, banks that face some fines, more than 50 banks over the past 16 years. And almost all of them were European banks and British banks. They paid highest fines, and they faced those highest fines, more than 90% of all fines. It's different for Turkey and some Turkish branches of U.S. companies faced those problems, but Turkish banks were more cautious. But there was this case against Hal Bank in the context of Iran, and even senior officials. They faced criminal proceedings from the United States. So on the one hand, there's close military cooperation, and on the other hand, there's a attempt to try to exert pressure on a sovereign nation through those tools, these economic and legal tools, using this criminal justice and criminal proceedings exterritorially. We had those wonderful talks. It was a great pleasure for me to listen to all of you. Now we have some time for questions and answers, so please, who would like to begin our today's Q&A session? So our audience is still contemplating on what we've just discussed. I have a question. So this alternative settlement systems, we are discussing that in detail, that in a perfect world, if we come to Ankara or Istanbul or Delhi or any other city or country, we could use not just Visa and MasterCard, but some local payment systems. In India, a huge work is in process in terms of this creating this settlement system or using Russian settlement system. So, dear colleagues, what do you think about that? Is it realistic to expect that those alternative payment systems, settlement systems, will be created, or it's just wishful thinking at this point, and dollar should still remain dominant in all the settlements, that we can't move away from it? So let's talk about this possible diversification of transactions. Who would like to take this question? Ekaterina, would you please be the first to answer this question? I will try to be brief. Dollar will continue to dominate, but this trend of it is being used less and less in international settlements. It will continue. There are lots of issues, political issues, with creating those alternative multilateral settlement systems within BRICS, for example, or some bilateral tools. It's not just politics, it's just about some regulations that prevents us from this fast and easy approval of using each other's settlement systems bilaterally, even with our partners. But I believe quite intuitively that everything that's happening in the world at this point, everything that we've discussed today, all states, all centers of power, that creates this feeling that in the context of this turbulence, vulnerability, unpredictability of risks, it's very important to ensure financial and technological sovereignty. So this idea is the cornerstone, as is the foundation for economic policy tasks that is present this legislative level in all our partnering countries. I think it's going to be an incentive that will make us and all our partners, BRICS partners and other partners and other centers of power in the global south, to move towards this gaining sovereignty, including national settlement systems, creating alternative multilateral tools. It's not a fast process, it's a complex process, politically complex and technologically complex, but I think that this trend is irreversible, and within 5 to 7 years we will see some frameworks that will make it possible to have this collective financial sovereignty, independence from those currencies and settlement systems that are now weaponized by the countries who want to strengthen their political dominance. Thank you so much, Ekaterina. Dear colleagues, since we don't have any further questions, I'd like to thank our guests for this wonderful speeches, reports. They were so thorough. We have a lot to think about. We, with great pleasure, we read your articles. We are happy to see you here in Moscow, in Sochi. I hope that we'll meet in person here in Moscow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone joining us today. See you again in the future. Goodbye.